It's my pleasure to welcome you to this book event for Ben Horowitz and his new book, The Hard Things About Hard Things. A wonderful title. And he'll be interviewed by Ruth Messenger, who is the president of the American Jewish World Service. Just a few things about Ben first and then about Ruth. This is a person who has now reached the level of a very big legend, legendary status in Silicon Valley and beyond. And of course he is with Andreessen Horowitz, a major firm investing in technology, startups and businesses. And there's a kind of magic about all of this in the West Coast and beyond. And all of us have countless questions about this world. And this is the person and his firm who've invested, are investors in Facebook and Twitter, and 150 companies. So he has been part of this, has been part of the startup world, part of the successful technology business world, and now part of the helping people. He's also a trustee of Columbia as well as a graduate of Columbia, where he studied computer science. I can tell you that as a trustee, I have come to see Ben as a very, very wise and insightful person. And it's no surprise that he is somebody that everybody wants to be part of their venture because you can just see the wisdom he brings. So we're lucky to have him part of our venture. And he's also the chair of the Entrepreneurship Initiative that is led by Richard Whitten here in the front row, who is also a trustee and, of course, a graduate of Columbia. So we're trying to bring some of the things that Ben will be talking about tonight to Columbia. There's been a lot happening in the past year. Ruth is a person who's served in public service in New York City Council and Manhattan Borough President, but heads up what is one of the foremost human rights organizations in the world. And this is a person who combines absolute dedication and a wonderful human spirit with dealing with some of the worst problems that exist in the world today. Unfortunately, there are far too many. So you have a great treat of listening to these two people discuss Ben's new book, The Hard Things About Hard Things. Ruth and Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very kind introduction.
So thank you very much, President Ballinger. This is the book, folks, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. I'm going to...
Drops today!
I'm going to ask Ben questions about it, and from time to time I'm going to throw out a quote from the book and ask him to respond to that. And there will be a time after a while, and I'll notify you when it's the case, for audience questions as well, and then it will be your job to stump him, which I think is impossible. Ben, the first most obvious question, what inspired you, given everything you do with family, with work, with advice, with travel, with music, what inspired you to sit down and write this book?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I was CEO, I used to kind of be awake at like 3 o'clock in the morning, sweating. And that's when I kind of understood what cold sweat meant, because before I'm like, I'm cold, well, I'm sweating. What's going on? And I was wondering to myself, like, why do none of the management books that I've read help me right now? Like, I need some help. And there were no help. And what I realized was all the management books that I've read were basically instruction guides on how to set up your company to keep you from screwing it up. But none of them said what to do once you'd already screwed it up, like how to fix it. And the problem with running a company is you always screw it up. Like there's nobody who's ever run one where it's not all messed up. And so what do you do at that point, and how do you deal with that situation? How do you deal with the hard things? And so that's why I felt like somebody needed to write that book.
In the introduction of the book, you say there's no recipe for really complicated dynamic situations. There's no recipe for building a high-tech company. There's no recipe for leading a group out of trouble. Well, that rings true for me because I run an international development organization. But in a time when almost everybody expects the quick fix, how do you navigate the challenge of not always having easy solutions to complex problems?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is psychological. Because things do go wrong. You fail constantly. And I think that, a lot of times people, particularly people who are put in those kinds of leadership positions, are very capable. They are used to getting very high scores on tests. And the problem is in the test of building something that nobody's ever built before, solving a problem that nobody's ever solved, like the mean on the test is not like 75, it's like 8. And so you got to feel good when you get a 9. And that is, that's difficult to learn. And it's difficult when you fail. And people laugh at you and write funny stuff and make annoying jokes. It's really hard to, at that point, keep focused and keep going forward and keep trying to find the answer. And that's something I don't really think, we get great training for. It's a hard thing to get training for. You're just kind of out there. But, that's probably the biggest thing is how do you get your mind to work when you're under that kind of pressure?
So one of the things that you've said is this is really all about the struggle. So can you tell us in some detail, what do you mean by the struggle? Maybe give us an example of a big struggle moment.
The struggle. All right. Don't admit that your faith is weak. Don't say that you feel like dying. Life's hard, then it feels like diamonds. Your home is so far gone. Much too late to even feel like trying. Don't understand what I'm saying. Don't understand what I'm implying. If you feel you don't want to be alive, you feel just how I am. That's Lupe Fiasco.
Not what you expect from the standard CEO, but exactly what makes Ben special.
Like that's how I open that piece. And I think that expresses that you get into a situation where, in building a company, you hire all the best, you come up with some idea, you convince people to join you, you hire all the best people, you tell them that this is going to be great for them. They sacrifice doing things like working at very high-paying jobs like Google. You get money from all the people who know and really care about you, including like sometimes your parents. And there you are starting this thing, and then you spend all your time on it, day and night. You have no other life, it's just this. And then everybody who you're connected to, who you respect and care about is involved, and then you're failing. And then it's going to go down, and all those people that you hired, it's going to be a giant waste of their time, and they're going to get laid off. And the people who gave you money, they're going to lose all their money. And how do you feel? And then how do you deal? And that's the struggle.
Tell me a time when the struggle, at that moment, when you feel you're about to go under, what do you summon up that has made you so successful?
Well, don't quit. That's my reason why. Don't quit. I think I wrote it, don't be a punk, and don't quit. There's a lot of things, but that's probably the biggest, is you have to stay in it. And a lot of it is, one of the things I wrote in the book is chances are, one of the lines, chances are you're dead. And the reason that I wrote that is my friend Peter Thiel has this really great thing he says between kind of a deterministic and an indeterministic world. And if you believe, in the old days we believed more kind of in a deterministic world where like there was an answer to the problem, a world of calculus, where like you could figure out how to go to the moon and build a rocket ship to go there. And lately we've moved into a world of statistics, an indeterminate world, and everything's just a probability. And like maybe, like if we tried to go to the moon, then like 8 times out of 10 we'd fail, so therefore we shouldn't go. And like everything is just a process for optimizing the probabilities. But when you're running something that's difficult, you have to believe in calculus. You have to believe there's a right answer. And even when chances are you're dead, you've got to find that answer. And, it's always out there. Hopefully you don't run out of time before you find it, but, that's all you can do. And I'd say if I did one thing well is when I was dead, I kind of kept looking for the answer, and eventually I found enough.
Can you say something about, sort of more broadly, about innovation in the business sector? Everybody who's not out there or not doing it right away sort of believes it's all changing faster than the speed of light. But, are we really changing the way we do lots of things?
Yeah, so I think we are changing. So I think it'd be probably worthwhile to kind of talk about innovation for a second, because I think it's often misunderstood. It's always misunderstood at the time. Not often. It's always misunderstood at the time. And by that I mean innovation always starts out looking like a bad idea. And the reason for that is if it looked like a good idea, then everybody would have already done it and it wouldn't be innovative. And it's kind of funny. And then the problem, of course, is that the other thing that looks like bad idea is a bad idea. So all of the kind of great innovations that have come along at the time kind of looked like bad ideas. The telephone, for example, Western Union had an opportunity to buy kind of AT&T way back when Alexander Graham Bell started it, and they passed. They said, it's a ridiculous idea. You can hardly hear. The sound quality is terrible. Like, why would you do that when you can have a very clear, error-corrected telegraph? It's insane. And now, like, it seems like a good idea, but then it did not seem like a good idea. And almost every innovation has been like that. They always look like bad ideas at the time. And so if you're the innovator, everybody kind of makes fun of you. Like, this is just how it is. They tease you. They say, a fake currency? You guys are idiots. You just don't get it. And that's kind of always what it feels like to be an innovator. And this is a big reason I always get the question as a venture capitalist from big companies, like, why can't we innovate? We're a big company. Why can't we innovate? Well, the reason that big companies can't innovate isn't because they don't have a lot of innovative ideas. They do. It's that they need agreement to go forward with them. They need a hierarchy to all agree on it. And the hierarchy can never agree on something that looks like a bad idea. So that's why like I exist, because big companies have trouble innovating. And the only big companies that consistently innovate are ones run by people who people regard as insane, like Larry Page, who will go like, I'm going to build a self-driving car. And everybody's like, oh, he's crazy. But that's kind of what innovation is. It's a breakthrough idea. It's an idea that looks like a bad idea at the time. And so if you have an idea, if you're an entrepreneur, and people say, wow, that sounds like a great idea, I won't build that company. They have to say, that sounds ridiculous. Let me tell you the 400 reasons why it won't work. Then you're onto something. So,
the book is, of course, rooted in the emerging sectors that you've contributed so much to: technology, social media, communications. But I wonder, while you were living this experience, while you were writing the book, do you think that what you have to say about management is actually more broadly applicable in the private and in the not-for-profit sectors?
Well, I think the book is about leadership and about trying to do something larger than yourself. And, and that turns out to be a hard thing. And I think that's why, people try it and then they go, oh, I'm not doing that again, too hot. And a lot of the trouble is there's no guidance. Now, I was like super fortunate in my career. I had like the greatest people helping. Bill Campbell was on my board. He helped me. He kind of had been through things like this. Mark Andreessen was on my board. And so that was amazing, but most people don't have that. And so this is kind of, what is that advice? How do you do something like that? How do you think about it? And I think that could be anything that's kind of complicated and hard to do, and maybe where it might take more than just you.
Okay, so there's a quote from the book, which I loved. If there is one skill to being a successful CEO, it is the ability to focus and make the best move when there are no good moves.
Yeah.
So give us an example.
Well, so I'll give you an example in my career. So I was running a company. I started a company called LoudCloud, which was it was the original cloud computing company. In fact, if you go back in the literature, the term cloud wasn't used really at all until LoudCloud. With respect to computers, it was used to describe originally kind of the old phone networks. In the old phone network, it was like we're going to have a smart cloud and dumb devices. So the devices wouldn't have to know how to route and bill and do all that stuff. That would be all handled by the cloud. And so we had the idea, well, there ought to be a cloud for software where you don't have to do all the complicated things about scaling it and so forth, and that would all be done in the cloud. And that was the original idea. The problem was we started in 1999, which was like 8 years too early. And it's not a good idea to be too early, despite what you might think. There's one of the great stories in computer science is Charles Babbage, who tried to build a computer in like 1840. And like now, historically, we love him, but boy, it was did not work, when he built the computer out of wood powered by steam. It was rough. And we were basically kind of building a cloud powered by steam, essentially. And so the company got into a spot where we had some success, but at least by my calculus, we were very likely to go bankrupt. And we kind of had to get out of it. But the problem was we were a public company. We were at like $60–70 million in revenue. But we were still going to go bankrupt. And so I had to kind of make a move to get us out of that somehow. And the thing that I decided to do, and I actually would sit up late at night and I would ask myself, I would be like, what's the worst thing that could happen? That was a kind of psychological technique I'd use on myself to kind of make myself feel better. So I'd say, what's the worst thing that could happen? And I said, well, if we continue as we're continuing, then we're going to go bankrupt. I'm going to have to lay everybody off. I'm going to lose all my investors' money, including my mom's money. And then, like, my reputation will be ruined forever. And, it didn't make me feel better at all. And so then I said, well, what would I do, like, if I went bankrupt, then what? Like, then what would I do after going bankrupt? And I thought, well, after I went bankrupt, maybe I would try and buy the software that we had built to run the cloud out of bankruptcy and maybe start a software company. And then I thought, well, is there a way to do that before I go bankrupt? And then I thought, well, if I could sell the services business and just keep the software business, then that would be a kind of a way to do that. And so I kind of cooked up this scheme to do it. Now, to the outside world and to the board of directors at the time, it seemed crazy because they're like, okay, you're a public company. The public markets don't think you're bankrupt, even though you are completely convinced. And I was right, by the way. We would have gone bankrupt. And you're going to sell all your customers and all of your revenue and like start a new business that like you don't even know will work. And I was like, yes, that's what I want to do. And, at that point, it's like, well, that's a bad idea. Like, that's a really bad idea. Like, to sell all your customers and all your revenue and, like, start a business that you have no, like, it's a bad idea. It's going to be a bad idea. But it was better, it was a bad idea, but it was better than the other idea, which is going bankrupt. And so, like, when you're deciding between, like, certain death and, like, certain misery and maybe death, certain misery and maybe death is better than certain death. And that was a very hard thing for people to get their head around. And actually, when we did the deal, So we did the deal. We were worth, as a company, about $100 million. Once we did the deal, everybody, all the institutional investors, basically sold all their shares, and we ended up being worth $29 million. And that's kind of was the starting point. Now, 5 years later, we were worth $1.6 billion when HP bought us. But nobody thought that was a good idea at the time. And if I had preserved what they had wanted and stayed at that $100 million valuation, their investment would have been worth nothing, like zero. And so that's kind of that kind of decision. And to make it, and the hardest thing about it, by far, was I didn't know I was right. I thought I was right, but I didn't know I was right. And the problem with thinking you're right and everybody thinks you're wrong is that if you are wrong, everybody is going to think you're an idiot. Whereas if you go with what they think, at least you did what everybody thought was the right thing, and you might feel better about yourself. And that is where leadership breaks down. It's at that point, when you don't have the courage to do what you think is right, even though everybody else thinks it's wrong. That's the failure case of leadership. That's a failure case of courage. And so a lot of what I talk about is how do you find that courage? How do you get that strength to make that decision? And I kind of just took a very hard look down the path that I was on, and it just wasn't a good path. And I didn't know if the other path, I thought it would work, but I didn't know it would work.
That's a great story. So this is, as it were, a slightly personal question, but you have made an amazing and generous decision, which is to donate the proceeds of this book to American Jewish World Service. We are unbelievably appreciative. But I want to know if you can tell me what inspired this donation, which you mentioned to me over a year ago, before the book was written.
Yeah. Well, it's either that or get a Bugatti. and Future and Ace Hood and Wheezy really had me thinking about that Bugatti. Look, I'm one of the most fortunate people in the world. I won the ovarian lottery. I was born in the United States, as Warren Buffett says. And there are people born in the world who have almost no chance. And most of the people, or not most of the people, but I think almost half of the people in the world live on $1 a day or less. And some of the people, particularly women, gay people, lesbians, transgender people, in those circumstances have even a lower chance. And so the ability for somebody like me, who has had every chance to make a contribution to people who need that chance, that's just too good an opportunity to pass up.
Thank you. When you were writing about that, when you did your blog post about that, and you talked about the epidemic of violence against girls and women today, you described it and compared it to the fight to abolish slavery. And I know from traveling with you in the Dominican Republic that the whole history of slavery is something you know a great deal about. And I just sort of wonder, why is that a particular historical passion, and what about that story sort of connects up to what you're doing today?
Yeah, and I should also say, kind of on the last point, that had it not been for my sister Sarah and my wife Felicia, I probably wouldn't even know about the AJWS. So I thank them for their leadership. I'm really a follower on that.
We thank them as well.
So slavery. So when I was a kid, I watched this show, this miniseries that Alex Haley, based on Alex Haley's book Roots, and it just blew me away because, I couldn't even believe that something like that had existed, where like everybody would just be like, oh yeah, this is fine. We'll like chain people up and break up families and kill people arbitrarily and so forth. It just seemed like completely absurd and unbelievable, and I could not understand how it happened. So I spent years actually, really studying. I read every book on slavery that I could. And the more I learned, and one thing was like Roots was actually quite incomplete on the history of it. And it was actually kind of like much darker and much more difficult than I had imagined. So one, it had existed for like nearly 10,000 years. Like, so human history is the history of slavery. Like no slavery or like, highly reduced slavery is something very, very recent. It's only in the last 200 years, and not even really in the last 150 years. And before that, the entire history of humanity was slavery, and this goes back, and if you read the Bible or the Quran carefully, you'll see they endorse it. They love slavery. They tell you, they have instructions on how to do it right. And so like it's just kind of part of the culture, part of who we are. And then if you get into the economics of slavery, slaves were very valuable pieces of property in those days. So like a slave, like the value of a slave was, anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 in today's terms in the U.S. And so that, if you think about something today where you would go to someone and say, okay, you own 20 slaves, so we're just going to take $2 million in value from you, like a very challenging just economic thing. So it's in the culture, it's economic, and so forth. And then, it was brutal in the U.S., but other places, like in the Caribbean, it was even worse, where if you go back to the start of slavery, 1 million slaves were brought to the U.S. from Africa, 2 million slaves were brought to the Caribbean. At the end of slavery, there were 4 million slaves in the U.S. and 700,000 in the Caribbean. It shows you like just the intensity of the brutality there. And so like this is what it was. And so I got to asking myself, how did it ever end? Like, how did that end? Totally built into the culture, like fully part of the economy. Like, how did that ever end? And it's amazing, the story. It was a tiny, tiny number of people who just said, like, this has got to stop. People, like a tiny group of leaders. The abolitionists started out, there was like 7 or 8 key people. And then there were people like Toussaint Louverture, who led the only successful slave rebellion in human history. Not in like, African slave trade, in human history, one successful slave revolution. And I was like, wow, how did they do it? How did they stop slavery with no internet, no nothing? Really, just think about that. Like, there's no airplanes. And this guy, Thomas Clarkson, he would like get on a boat and sail from like England to the Caribbean and like write down everything he saw and then get back on the boat and go like try and tell him, hey, this is not what the slave owners are saying. It's way worse. Let me tell you what they do. They like bury slaves down to their neck and they stuff their mouth full of dynamite and they like light it and blow their heads off. Like, that's what these guys are doing. Like, do you want to be part of that? And like, that is what changed it. And that's what ended slavery. And so, I sit back and I go, then I traveling with Ruth, understanding what's going on in the world. And there are women in the world with no rights. Like, they are basically sold, to a husband. And then they have no self-determination, no free will. They're beaten and often killed and not allowed to be educated, just like slaves, so it's not the same, but it's the same. And when you read the defenses of it, it's just like the defenses of slavery. It's like, well, this is our culture. Our culture will break if you end this. So, as I, got into that, I felt like, and as a kid, I always said, if slavery ever was around in my day, if it was ever around, I would be like John Newton, I'd be like Thomas Clarkson, I would try to stop it. And then, like, here I am. And so that's where that came from, and that's how I feel about that. Sorry for the long lesson.
No,
but this is a university.
So thanks particularly to Felicia. You joined us last year on a trip to the Dominican Republic, and you saw grassroots organizations that were working to promote human rights. And many of those people in their own situation really think about themselves as innovators or entrepreneurs. And I just wonder, as you saw the solutions they were coming up with, could you see connections with the kind of work that you're doing? Were there ways that you thought that either you or we as American Jewish World Service should be helping them? How do you compare what they're doing at the grassroots level with some of the work you've done and the changes you've made?
Yes, so I think, there's one particular story that I'll share. I think it's super parallel in that, again, it's about leadership. And so we met a gentleman there, and he had grown up in Haiti. And in Haiti, he had become a doctor. And but for a lot of circumstances in Haiti, as many of you know, has turned into like a pretty rough place lately. He moved to the Dominican Republic. And when he arrived in the Dominican Republic, they did not recognize him as a doctor. And so he had to survive, so he got a job picking sugarcane, like literally the work that you would have done if you had been a slave. Very hard. Sugarcane picking is basically the hardest manual labor there is. And by doing that, he was able to put himself back in high school, re-get a high school degree, then re-got a college degree, and then became a doctor again. And then once he was a doctor, the Dominican Republic changed the law. And they decided that, and you have to understand, Dominican Republic and Haiti are a single island divided by a forest. And Haitians have been migrating and back and forth for a century. They decided that anybody with any Haitian blood in the Dominican Republic would no longer be a citizen. And this is regardless of how long you were there or whether you were a citizen before. And so you could be living there for 3 generations, only speak Spanish. In Haiti, the language is French. And one day, you have no right to medical services. You have your kids, second graders, will be thrown out of school. And you're just on your own. You're not a citizen. You're an illegal or a second class, a non-entity. And so if you're him, so here's this guy who's been through all that and this happens. And I'm thinking to myself, chances are you're dead. You're done. You went through all that, and now this is it. Now you're not even a citizen. You're dead. And so you know what he does? He starts a mobile health clinic for the Haitian non-citizens so that they can have babies safely, so they can be tested for HIV, so if they're sick, they can get healed. And he's just doing that. And then Ruth's organization is supporting him and trying to help him, provide resources for that. And you think about that kind of leadership and that kind of determination, and you go, wow, yeah, that's applicable anywhere. If he can do that, what can I do? And so he's a great inspiration for me. It was an amazing thing to be able to go down there, and I think that, people like that are just invaluable to the world. And so anything that I can do to support them, that's what I'm about. That's why I'm selling books hard this week. Buy it, baby.
So I'm going to go back to the book. There's a place in the book where you quote someone else in business as saying, we take care of the people, the products, and the profits in that order. And then you say, taking care of the people is the most difficult. And if you don't do that, the other 2 don't matter. And you have a lot of sections in the book where you talk about some of the hard things. How do you bring new people into an organization? How do you lay off your friends? How do you change CEOs in midstream? And I just wonder if you'd talk about sort of what you've learned about the importance of taking care of people.
Well, all these organizations are just, and I work in the information business, right? And it turns out that's what's important in the information business is people. And I think, it's really important everywhere. And you can get lost in that because, when you go in front of, and I was a public company CEO for 6.5 years, and when you go in front of Wall Street and the investors, nobody ever asked me, how are your people doing? Do they feel good about what they're working on? Nobody asks you that. People really don't generally even ask you that in a board meeting. Like nobody, that's never the thing you're getting graded on. And so, you know, it's easy to lose yourself. It's easy to lose track of that. But if you don't do that, then you're in deep, deep trouble. And actually, it's funny because I started this company in this industry that kind of had a reputation, at least within firms, for like not being, you know, it's just like money. They'll get money, that'll be fine. And so, you know, coming from my orientation, I said, you know what, how people are doing, do they feel like they're able to make a contribution? Do they feel like their work matters? Do they feel like their contributions are being recognized? Is every bit as important and more important than money? And that was really most of my philosophy when we started Ben Horowitz. And when we started it, like starting a new first-tier venture capital firm was not something that anybody thought was possible in 2009 in an industry that old. But really, that's all that we did that was different. I think we just like looked at it through the lens of the people, both in the firm and the people starting the companies, from their perspective as opposed to from our perspective. And that made all the difference. So I think that if there's one thing I could give you if you want to start a company, it's that.
And that's one of the things you look at now from Ben Horowitz when you're deciding what to invest in. That's an element of what you look at.
Well, the whole fundamental premise behind the firm is that we believe that the people who started the companies can run the companies. And so, you know, prior to that, the formula was the inventor invents, and then you bring in a professional to run the company so that you can make it big fast. And we thought that that wasn't right, that you know, the person who started the company, the innovator, is the person who will be able to continue to innovate and maintain in the innovation business. And so we were completely focused on the people and the leadership capabilities of the founders that we backed. And that, you know, that has been our differentiator.
And what about when they call you for advice?
Well, you know, that's most of my day is talking to entrepreneurs about advice. And like, you know, and the big thing, it's funny, I was telling somebody earlier today, my wife says something to people, like if something bad happens to someone, and you know, she can see they're sad, or like, you know, maybe they lost somebody that they loved, or something bad happened. She'll say to them, she'll say, look, you don't have to say anything back to me, but I just want you to know that you're not alone. And that's a lot of what I do. I just let people know they're not alone.
And you wrote in the book, the only thing that prepares you to run a company is running a company.
Yeah, that's a sad truth, Dave. There is no training. Welcome to the show. Yeah, that is true. So, look, it is such a complicated job. You can't. Like, I was you know, I was the most important, I would say, general manager at a company called Netscape, which was one of the most important companies of its day. I ran a big organization. I had a lot of people. I was totally unprepared to be CEO. And I sucked at it.
I'm interested, and I think other people might be interested, in the more expansive parts of your life. So you rapped for us a bit before. There's rap throughout the book, and I know how
my mixtape's out on the internet, rapgenius.com. Get it? That's not a joke.
So what is it about rap, about the photos you have of boxers on the wall? What is it about the rest of the world that sort of helps you define who you are and how you relate to the world?
Yeah, that is a good question. I need to figure out how to fit my answer into an hour or less. So I've had a lot of experiences in my life where one of the biggest lessons in my life is, like, everybody sees the world through their own prism. Everybody's their own protagonist. And so that when two people look at the same thing, they see different things. And a lot of people consider that a bug, and I consider that a feature. And you know, it's paid incredible dividends for me throughout my life. Well, I'll give you one example. When I was, which is the most recent thing that I've written, and why my mixtape actually is on Rap Genius. When I was 20 years old, I got a call from my mother, and she had told me that kind of one of my best friends, there was a family down the street who I kind of grew up with, and I went on all the family vacations with them, and we, ate dinner together all the time. And one of the kids in that family had been shot in the face, and he was going to be blind for his whole life. And it was this most tragic thing I could imagine. I was 20 years old. It was much more than I could handle, and I didn't know what to do. And like every time I'd call home, it was getting worse and worse. He didn't speak to anyone, utter a word for 3 months. And I'm in New York, in New York, and it was 1980, 86, 87, and so it was kind of the beginning of hip hop. And there was this great DJ on the radio, cool DJ Red Alert, and he would play these songs about this new kind of music. And the music was so incredible because it was music about people, they were rapping about having nothing. They were rapping about living in the worst parts and having literally nothing, and then how great they were going to be. And it was just so inspiring. I thought I've got to record this and send it to Seth. And so I recorded all the Red Alert shows and I put it in an envelope and I sent it to Seth. And and then when I called back, people would say, he's not talking except for if he's talking about Red Alert, and how he remixed Rock the Bells. I was just so excited, and I went down there and we formed a rap group called the Blind Deaf Crew, Blind and Deaf, DEF, get it? And we made this tape, and we tried to get signed to a recording contract, which did not succeed. But one of the things that taught me was look, these guys looking at the world in this way kind of changed Seth's life, who was looking at the world in another way, and it's had such a high impact. And to me, that's kind of the value. That's the actual value of diversity. And I think people get it really confused because what they do is they try to get people of other backgrounds to look through their prism. And so, and this plays in companies and hiring all the time. It's okay, we have our criteria, okay, and now we want an African American or a Hispanic person. And then so we're going to say, okay, take our criteria test and look through our prism and see how you do. Oh, you didn't do well enough, but we still want you, so we're going to bring you in anyway, but everybody in the organization is going to know that we changed the criteria, to get you in. But that's not the right idea. The right idea is you got to look through the world through their prism. And I'll give you a great example of this. So in my own firm, I had a guy who's an investment banker, and he starts hiring all investment bankers. And we're not an investment bank. But that was his background, so that was his prism, so he valued people who could look through that prism. And then I had another woman who, brilliant woman running marketing, and everybody in her organization was a woman. And I was like, why can't any men get a job working for you? And she said, well, I've got a criteria that they never pass. And I was like, well, what's your criteria? She said, helpfulness. And I was like, we're a services firm. Why don't any of my other managers have that criteria? They should all be hiring on helpfulness. And these are the kinds of things. And so if you don't commit to looking through somebody else's prism, you don't actually get to diversity. And if you don't get to diversity, then you're looking at the problem in one way. And when you get stuck and you don't have a move, you're going to have a hard time finding it because everybody in your organization is looking through that problem through the same prism. And that's, and that served me well. That's how I was, people say, well, wow, how did you get out of that? How did you turn that company around? Well, I had people looking at the problem through a lot of different viewpoints.
And how were you able, as a person, to sort of hear someone else's viewpoint, sort of step back from your own perception enough to see the genius in what they were doing?
That's a good question.
I'm pushing him now. He didn't know about all of these questions.
Yeah. Well, a lot of it is, so, one of the things that, I'll give you an example. We were hiring a person into the firm under this guy who is kind of hiring all investment bankers. And he was looking at investment bankers, and I was like, so what is this job? And he's like, well, this job is to kind of build relationships with all the companies we didn't invest in. And I was like, well, what kind of person do you think you need for that? And he starts going down through all these investment banking criteria. And I said, well, wouldn't it be somebody who people like to be around? And he goes, well, yeah. And I said, do you know anybody who likes to be around investment bankers? He was like, oh. And I said, you know, there are certain, I said, you have to look at, from a cultural standpoint, you know, what are the cultures that like to engage people where people relationships are important? You know, where getting to know somebody is the most important thing. Like, what are those cultures? And, you know, and like, what are those criteria? And what is that about? And like, why don't you broaden your net, and why don't you find somebody who people want to be around? And it's interesting, like, he ended up hiring an African American. And like, from my standpoint, I'm like, that's not surprising, because that's an attribute that, you know, in the people that I know, is going to be more prevalent, where somebody really wants to understand somebody and get to know somebody and cares about the person first and then the thing second. Like, that's a real strength that I've seen with the people who I know coming from that background. And that's not to say that everybody's African American is friendly, because they're not. Some are real mean. Just like, you know, there's like real mean, like European Americans. But, you know, you're looking for strengths and you're looking for certain criteria. You have to broaden your mind. You can't just look for what you want. Oh, sorry, somebody's calling me on the phone. Let me turn off.
They want to buy a book.
Yes, they want to buy a book. Sorry. But, you know, different cultures have different strengths, and you have to value the strengths and not focus on what you know and not focus on weaknesses. And I think that's what we do all too often, and that's why we get such uniformity in the organization. So what I try to do is help people look beyond themselves. And I realize what I'm saying is like fairly controversial. He's like, isn't he profiling? And I'm like, you know what? Every hiring manager, and I'll tell you the truth, profiles all the time. And they just don't admit it because they're looking at it from their perspective. They're looking at it from their own profile. And so what you got to do is you have to broaden the profile. And you have to value things that you wouldn't ordinarily value because they're about you. And that's, so sorry, I get like fired up about that topic sometimes.
That's great. You talked before about your good luck in having some people who were supportive of you, gave you good advice, and you write about them pretty eloquently in the book. If you had to pick like two people and a piece of advice they gave you that's still with you all the time or that stood you in good stead, what would you come up with?
He gave me good advice. Well, so one piece of advice came from Bill Campbell, which was like quite a funny piece of advice, or not so funny at the time. So we were kind of getting to the edge of our money, and it was following the dot-com crash. And after the dot-com crash, basically the private equity markets had completely dried up. There was no way to raise money. And so, you know, I didn't really have much choice, so we looked at also going public. But the problem with going public was that we just weren't, in a lot of ways, we weren't ready for it. You know, we weren't very good at forecasting. We were having a lot of churn in the business. You know, it was a very volatile environment given the macro economic situation. And so I go to the board meeting and I kind of present the alternatives, you know, like here's how much money we have left in the bank. This is what staying private is like. This is, you know, going public. You know, here are all the problems, like we can't forecast, like, you know, we've got great churn in the customer base, et cetera, and like, you know, we're probably not ready for that. And so Bill goes, you know, this long pause, and Bill, who's on my board, says, Ben, it's not the money. It's the fucking money. And I was like, oh, I guess we're going public. But that was, it's uncomfortably funny. That was kind of the point that I learned that, look, it was bad to go public. It was really bad. In fact, Business Week wrote a story called The IPO from Hell about like my company. Like, you can look it up, The IPO from Hell. That was bad. Worse would have been not going public. And that was one of the toughest lessons that I learned was, okay, there's bad and there's worse. And so I learned that from Bill. You know, another really good piece of advice actually came from Mark Andreessen, and he said to me, he was actually quoting Karl Marx. And he said, sharpen the contradictions. Now, when Karl Marx said it, he was actually talking about the labor and capital. Sharpen the contradictions between labor and capital. That's not what Mark meant when he said it. What he meant was probably the greatest kind of management advice that I've ever gotten is when you're managing a group of people, there's always contradictions. There's always conflict. There's always somebody who wants to do one thing and others that want to do another thing. And the worst thing you can do is try and smooth that over. Make it go away. Damp it down. Let it fester. The best thing you can do is sharpen the contradictions. Raise it to the surface, resolve it, and move forward. And even if you may resolve it in a way that one party doesn't like, but you've got to sharpen the contradictions. You've got to get it if you want to move forward, if you want to move fast, if you don't want an organization that degenerates into politics and other kinds of backbiting, passive aggressive behavior, all these kinds of things.
Well, we're going to take that as a piece of advice for everybody here. We are going to open this up to questions from the audience. There are mics. I, of course, can't see them, but there are in the center of the two aisles, there are mics. So if you have a question for Ben, please line up and prepare to ask it. I will take the prerogative of the moderator to tell you that a question is not a sentence with an inflection up at the end. A question is an actual question. We would prefer that you actually frame a question and ask it. And we'd like to do that for a while, and then I'm going to ask Ben to give us his close, and then the program will close, and there'll be a chance later for you to buy books and get them signed. Your question.
Thank you for speaking, Mr. Horowitz. What have you seen is the most...
I'm going to interrupt for 1 minute. I suspect Ben would love to know if you are an undergraduate student, a graduate student, or some other animal.
I'm an other animal.
Okay.
Okay.
What is the most common thing you've seen that divides people who succeed at running technology companies from those who fail at running technology companies?
Courage.
Thanks.
And courage is a hard one. Everybody, thinks they have it, and then nobody thinks they have it. And the best thing I ever heard on courage was something that Mike Tyson said, which was relayed by his trainer, Customato, which is the difference between a hero and a coward is not what they feel. They feel the exact same thing. It's what they do.
Thanks.
Thank you. Over here.
Hi, Ben. My name's Amy. I'm an undergraduate in Columbia College.
Undergraduate?
Yes.
All right, go
Good.
college, baby. College. That's me. CC.
Earlier on, you mentioned that the key to success is to not quit, but I was wondering how you reconcile that with knowing when to quit just because it actually is a bad idea.
Yeah, well, sometimes you have to change the idea. Look, very early on, you might find that like nobody wants, you come up with an idea, you put it out there, and this is a great thing about today's kind of entrepreneurial world that wasn't true in my day, is like you can try something and get it to market with a very small number of people and a kind of very small amount of money. So like if you build something and you put it out there and nobody wants it, then you either have to kind of fundamentally change the idea or like it's not going to work. But it's tricky because you may be close to the right idea, or you may, and a lot of this comes from like, why do you start a company in the first place, or why do you do something in the first place? And I think that the key is like the worst reason to start a company is because you want to start a company. The worst reason to do something is because you want to do it for some personal reason. The best is that there's some problem that you're having or that just needs solving and nobody is stepping up to solve it. And I think if that's your point of origin, then it's very unlikely that there's just a regular reason to quit.
Thank you.
Over here.
All right. Good afternoon. My name's Yves, and I'm a grad student at SIPA.
Very good to meet you, Steve.
Eve.
Eve.
Yeah. So two quick questions. Well, one question and one comment. You talked about the money earlier, so I wanted to get your opinions on access, whether it's to resources, mentors, or capital, especially for entrepreneurs, minority entrepreneurs. And the second part of it, which is a comment, I was born and raised in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, so thanks for the shout out to Toussaint Louverture and the revolution, the successful revolution. One thing I wanted to say though, I understand that it's, you know, the way Haiti's projected is often negative, but I want to say that there are tons of opportunities there, and you have a lot of young women and men who are innovative, and we would love your contribution in that sense. I know you're involved in human rights, I guess, in the Dominican Republic, but I would love to help lead an initiative in Haiti in the youth, especially in the technology sector.
Yes, no, that's so one, thank you for that, and I agree with that. And just, you know, the thing about Haiti that I should add is important to recognize is the Haitian people, the only successful slave revolution in history. And the greatest leadership book I've ever read is actually a book called The Black Jacobins by, or Jacobins, how do you pronounce it?
Jacobin.
It's Jacobins, Jacobins, by C.L.R. James. And it's the story of Toussaint. And it's really, like, he was certainly the most remarkable leader that I ever read about in depth. And the legacy of that, you know, the legacy of those people are in Haiti today, and you know, there is great opportunity there. So I just want to reinforce that as well. In terms of getting capital, you're kind of living in the greatest time in human history to get capital. So there's many different, you know, there's so many different sources of it, and for so many different kinds of projects. But you know, to me, the key, you know, as a funder of things is the competency and determination of the team. So, you know, like, who is on the team? How do they work together? What have they accomplished so far? What have they done on whatever money they had? Those are the things that are most compelling, you know, even, you know, much more compelling than a really good story, which is always the other thing I would say is get really good at storytelling. That's like the two most important skills, as I'm sure Ruth will agree, are storytelling and fundraising.
Agreed. Over here.
Okay. Hi, good evening. I'm Victoria Nagy. I'm a senior in the engineering school studying applied math. And I'm really thankful that you're here today because I've always wanted to meet you. But my question is more about your education. I was wondering, what do you feel like you gained the most from your undergraduate experience at Columbia? And what do you feel like we can do today to, like, better enhance our education for young people to be able to be better prepared to be innovative in our world?
Yeah. Well, on innovation, congratulations on majoring in, like, great things to help in innovation, because one of the things that we talk about in the entrepreneurship community or committee now is that because of, for a lot of reasons, but computer science and information science has been the one area that's kind of avoided the regulatory regime, which turns out to be very important from an innovative standpoint, in that it's really hard to innovate in an area where there's heavy regulation because it gets very expensive. For example, the cost of bringing a new drug to market is $4 billion. That's really hard for a new company to do, but the cost of bringing a new piece of software to market, you know, might be, you know, a couple $100,000, and that's a real thing. So you have a great skill if that's kind of where you want to go, at least as far as the business world is concerned. You know, in the philanthropic world and other things, there are other ways to innovate as well. In terms of, you know, what I learned at Columbia, so that the things that have really paid off for me is, one, you know, I ended up being a computer science major, and that was extremely helpful. It was unusual in today's world, in that the first computer science class I ever took was at Columbia. And one of the greatest things about Columbia is they don't make you declare a major when you arrive. Because I wouldn't have declared that when I was in high school, but I took the class, and, you know, it was a great class. And And I think that's probably the number one thing is do what you like, and I like computer science, so I did that. And then the second thing is, Columbia is extremely valuable in opening up the world, and a lot of what college is about is becoming more sophisticated. So if I would say, there's one thing that I would advise in college is don't do what you already know, like broaden yourself out and meet people who you don't know, and do things that you won't do, and that's kind of makes you more part of the world. And being able to play in the world is the number one thing that you get out of Columbia, as opposed to being able to play in your neighborhood or your state or whatever it is, your country even.
Thank you.
There you go. There's your tagline for the next class. Yes.
Good evening, Mr. Horowitz. My name is Anshul. I'm an undergraduate at Columbia Engineering, and I'm involved with the Entrepreneurship Society on Campus Core. So thank you for coming out. My question is, which side of the argument do you support? The one which is prominent in Silicon Valley, which favors students dropping out of colleges, or the other one, which is what my parents support, which is staying in college for at least 4 years?
So, there are very few notable cases where guys have dropped out of college, like Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, and gone into wild success. But look, a lot of people, Dave Packard, Andy Grove, Larry Page, did not drop out of college. So I wouldn't say that. I think the reason the guys who dropped out of college succeeded was not because they dropped out of college. It was because they had an idea that was so compelling that it compelled them to do things like drop out of Harvard. Now, most people don't have an idea that compelling. And if you don't, for the love of God, stay in school.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a civil engineering grad student, so limited technology experience. But my question is, why do venture capitalists invest in what I would consider to be white people problems, as in they're not that compelling, and yet these co-founders get a couple $1,000,000 to deliver smoothies via your iPhone or something?
Okay, so I'm going to defend white people problems for a second.
Anyone needs a smoothie, but...
Look, here's one of the things that I think it's very important to recognize about technology is technology often starts at the top but then gets democratized. And let me just give you one example, the cell phone. So when cellular phones first came out, they cost thousands of dollars. They were large. Only very high-paid executives had them. They carried them in briefcases. They were white people problem. Like who needs to talk on their phone when they're like walking down the street? But as a result of that, the now smartphone, computer in your pocket is available everywhere. Soon it's going to be available to the poorest of the poor. And it's helping Ruth transform the world. It gives people access to services and education that there's no way they would otherwise get. And so a technological breakthrough that starts solving like a problem for the people who can afford it, down the line can have very profound implications. So I definitely wouldn't be dismissive of that. Now, that's not to say there aren't other problems that need to be solved, and that kind of attitude would make you a very good entrepreneur.
That was great. Thanks.
Hey, how you doing? Leo Nolan, 09, Columbia College. Just was hoping to get a comment on the very public fight playing out right now between your founder and
Carl Icahn.
Yes. Seems to be all over CNBC, etc.
You want to talk about Carl Icahn and Mark? Well, look, Carl Icahn is a guy who's made a lot of money and loves to be in the news, and so the best way to get in the news is by attacking somebody. It's kind of silly if you actually look at it. So for those of you who don't know, Carl Icahn is an activist shareholder who's invested in eBay, and he's kind of agitating for eBay to do certain things. And as a way to kind of tweak them and get more coverage of his story, he's attacked my business partner, Mark Andreessen, for being on the board and also being a venture capitalist, because he says that causes conflicts of interest. If you look at the history of eBay, when Mark got there, innovation was dead, like gone, dead, nothing, and their stock price was plummeting, and they had completely lost their ability to innovate. If you know the inside story of how things worked operationally. And so John Donahoe made the very courageous move to say, look, we need somebody who's great at innovation and knows everything that's happening in the world today. And he got Mark, who invented the browser, so brought us the modern internet that we all use today. This is the guy who brought it to us, and he's completely up to date on every new technology. And the result of that combination has been eBay has completely turned itself around from an innovation standpoint. The stock price is up 6x. And, and their mobile product is great, and they're really making good moves. So, that's been the impact. And so Carl Icahn is now complaining about that because, he's like a short seller advocate. He's manipulating people. He's manipulating the press. I mean, it's hard for me. I don't have anything nice to say about him, although he's hilarious.
We're going to run out of time soon, so I'm just going to ask the remaining questioners to ask your question as short as possible.
Hello, my name is Zach Gleischer. I'm in Columbia College studying computer science. I had a question about overcoming failure. What is your advice to someone who puts in their best effort and they fail when they feel that their best is just not good enough?
But I guess my best wasn't good enough, so here. Sorry. Drake's uncle wrote that song. His name is Larry Graham, for those of you who are kids. Little music history. Look, you're going to fail. If you try and do something great, you're going to fail a lot. And that's just one of the things that people ask or say snarkily about Silicon Valley is there's too many people solving easy problems. Why don't people solve really hard problems? Because they're hard. Because you fail. Because people laugh at you and make you feel bad about yourself and, call you names and say you're an idiot and dismiss you and all that kind of stuff. And I can tell you, I have failed a tremendous amount. I'm sure Ruth has failed a tremendous amount. That's what it is. That's what separates the women from the girls. That's what makes you somebody who can contribute on a worldwide basis and make a difference versus somebody who, has got to stay in their lane. So, that is what it is. It's hard. There's nothing easy about it. It sucks. Failure sucks. But it's part of the process.
Good. Over here.
Hi, Ben. I'm Michelle. I'm part of Columbia Organization of Rising Entrepreneurs. I'm also in Columbia College. Thank you for setting such a good example for the Columbia startup community. We're really proud of you. And my question is, you're both really interested in the charity world and the business world, but these two worlds function on really different mechanisms. And so some people are saying the nonprofits don't have the same mindset of business expanding and that kind of efficiency. And I'm personally running a nonprofit project, and people are advising me to turn it into for-profit and these kind of conflicts. So how do you think of the current charity system, ecosystem? And do you think it's the best way of making impact and serving people? And do you believe in impact investing? Thank you. Sorry, it's a little bit long.
Well, you have to do both. And I think there was a comment earlier, which is why do businesses solve white people problems? And because that's where the money is. And it's, so why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. And as a result of that, it does move downstream over time and so forth, but there are a lot of people that there are a lot of problems and a lot of people that you can't reach just through a business lens. They're just not going to be profitable businesses. And for that work, that very important work, that life-saving work, that world-changing work that takes somebody who has no chance and gives them a chance, and that person changes the world, that has to be done through charity. I think people who philosophically say that charity is not a good idea, and the ultra libertarians, they're just wrong, and you just got to tell them they're wrong, and and I don't know how else to describe it, but like it's just a not correct worldview.
In order to meet my commitments to the university, I'm going to ask that the people at the mic just say your question very quickly, all of you, like back and forth quickly, and then Ben will figure out what he can get into the next 2 minutes.
Okay, my memory's not that good, so
well, I'll try to keep track.
I'll try and be very quick, and I hope it's not a repeat question. I was actually going to ask about the philanthropical aspect of owning a business. And to summarize, I hope I'm not asking the same question, but I am an alumna of Columbia College 2005, but I'm also a small business owner. And so I was thinking about tying in a philanthropical aspect into my business in the third year. What do you think about choosing a philanthropy or a mission that kind of revolves around the reason why you started the business?
Oh, yeah, let's get the rest of the questions out.
Okay.
I'm a grad student from the journalism school. We're seeing a lot of startups in the media industry these days. I think Andreessen also wrote about it recently, but what's your take on the market? Do you think there's a lot of potential, or do you think it's already saturated?
Okay, go ahead.
Azar Quater, class of 2002. Very quickly, do you think there's a bubble in tech?
Hi, my name is Chris, and I'm a sophomore in CC. My question is, what did your company look for in the first few employees it hired?
Oh, great. Last question.
Omar Malik, and I was curious, when you look at the companies that you've invested in or look at companies in the technology space over a long period of time, I was curious what the correlation was between the technical prowess of the founder and the outcome. And what I'm getting at is sometimes you have really talented founders technically, and then other times you have more MBA types that have hired that quantitative skill set, and was just wondering if there was any different outcomes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I think I'll answer the two that I know the best answer to, which is the kind of media company one and the are we in a bubble? And I apologize to everybody else for not having time. So in terms of, is now a good time to start a new media company? I would say yes, absolutely. So the thing that's there's obviously a giant disruption going on in media, and in particular, the kind of existing distribution monopolies are being broken as a result of technology. So, in the early days, I'll just give you one example. In the early days of journalism in the United States, almost every one of the founding fathers had their own newspaper. And people look at that today and they say, how is that possible? Well, they were actually like blogs. They were just like them writing their opinion, and and they were all like very heavily their point of view. And so it was a different kind of thing then, because the printing press was relatively new, and distribution was very haphazard and hadn't consolidated. And then over time it evolved, and the distribution channels consolidated. Most cities reduced to one or at most two newspapers, and so to get news, you had to get it through one of those sources, and that changed the product radically, where the kind of news all consolidated. So you had sports and international news and so forth all together in one. Well, now that distribution monopoly is gone, and the adjustment to whatever it's going to be has not yet occurred. So it started off looking a lot like the Founding Fathers' newspapers, but I don't think that's how it's going to end. It's going to evolve. It's going to include more things. It's going to get more dynamic, and the cost structures are going to be different, and the way it's done is going to be different, and there are great opportunities there to both do great work and I think have interesting businesses. So I do not think journalism is dead. I think it's just getting started, and so if you're coming from the journalism school, that's a great place to be if you're an entrepreneur. Then on are we in a bubble? It's funny, I had a big debate on this with Steve Blank in 2010 in The Economist, where he said it was a bubble, and I said, no, you're out of your mind, and I was right. And it's funny, so I was right, and 75% of the readers voted that he was right. And then it was funny because he called me and he said, Ben, your argument was so convincing, I changed my mind. But the readers all were so convinced it was a bubble that they said he was right. And the reason I knew for sure it wasn't a bubble is because everybody thought it was a bubble. And when it's a bubble, Nobody thinks it's a bubble. That's how it becomes a bubble, right? When everybody thinks it's a bubble, it's not a bubble, like by definition. So like just the fact that you're asking me this question means the answer is no. But actually, let me kind of get more specific than that. So a lot of people keep comparing it to, oh, it's like 1999, look at these high prices. Things have changed since, so in 1999, I was at Netscape, we had 90% market share of the web browser, and we had 50 million users, which meant there were 55 million people on the internet worldwide. And half of those were on dial-up. And today there are over 2.5 billion people on the internet, and it's going to 5 billion. And so the market size is way bigger. And the businesses that people are going, how could that be, are way bigger. And the old laws of business physics on distribution have changed in the following sense. Facebook is 10 years old and has $10 billion in revenue. This year, they're going to do $10 billion in revenue. In the entire history of business, like that's not happened before. And so like that part really is something. And if you look at these companies that are being valued very highly, they're real businesses. Unlike the things we had in 1999, they've got like very big revenue and potential. So it's not obviously a bubble. It's certainly not a 1999 bubble. That's not to say things aren't like, multiples aren't too high or things aren't getting overvalued or people are getting overly excited. Yeah, it always happens. That's the nature of investors. Wall Street's the most emotional place in the universe, and the efficient market hypothesis is nonsense. Like things are not priced correctly ever. And that's just kind of like, that's the reality of it. But to say that we're in a bubble, a tech equity bubble like we were before, I think that's a misunderstanding of what's going on.
Thank you very, very much, Ben. Closing remarks are going to be given by Richard Whitten, University Trustee Emeritus and Special Advisor to the President. Great.
I really don't have much to say other than to thank Ruth for a terrific job of moderating, and mostly to thank Ben for the breadth of his interest, for the depth of his understanding of so many things. A proud son of Columbia College, and you would know that the core curriculum was alive and well when you listen to the way in which Ben handles very complex and assorted topics the way he has. So thank you very, very much, Ben and Ruth, for your participation this evening. It was wonderful.
Good.
I'd like to invite everyone back in the faculty room is behind us for reception, and Ben will be available to sign books and to perhaps take some questions. So thank you very
Ben.
much on behalf of Columbia.
Thank you so much.